Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the workshop series for the DMZ's COVID-19 Challenge, Hack the Curve. Today's webinar is hosted by the DMZ, and the speakers are from one of DMZ's legal partners, Fasken. Fasken is an international full-service business law firm with lawyers specializing in advisory services with a practice dedicating to assisting startup and emerging tech companies. Fasken is one of the partners in the Professionals in Residence, or PIR program, which brings industry experts in-house to the DMZ. And under the program, current and alumni DMZ founders have access to PIR pro bono office hours and discounted engagement fees. Throughout the webinar, you'll have a chance to ask questions to the speakers, and at the end, I will share my contact information if you'd like to have a conversation offline. So before we get started, let me introduce myself. I'm Sweeny D'Souza, the Partner Success Lead at the DMZ and your moderator for today's webinar. I also have with me Jose Bonicelli, Space and Tech Assistant at the DMZ, who will help facilitate the webinar. Here are a few housekeeping items for today. You will get a chance to meet your speakers, as each presenter will turn on their audio and video as they're speaking to make the webinar as engaging as possible. Please use the Q&A feature of Zoom to ask your questions, not the chat feature. Please feel free to ask a question while our presenters are speaking. However, we'll have a Q&A session after each part, and that's where we'll get to answering your questions. Also, please know that the webinar is being recorded, and the recording and the slides will be made available after the webinar is completed. At the end of the webinar, there will be a poll that will appear on each attendee screen. So please take a minute before leaving the webinar to let us know how we did today. So our webinar will have two parts. Part one is structuring your startup in the wake of COVID-19, followed by a Q&A session with the speakers. And part two will be considerations for team in the healthcare and medical care space in the wake of COVID-19, which will be followed by an Ask Me Anything session with an expert. So as we begin, let me take a moment to introduce our speakers for the first part. So we have with us Will Shaw, who is a partner and the co-lead of the Toronto Emerging Companies Group at Fasken. He advises a broad range of participants in the technology sector, including early stage and growth stage companies, in addition to angel and institutional investors. Joining him, we have Andre Garber, partner and co-lead of the Toronto Emerging Companies Group at Fasken. Andre is a recognized leader in Ontario's tech ecosystem and has cultivated relationships with emerging growth companies and venture capital investors from around the world. So we do have with us also Stuart Kozlick, who will be hosting or presenting in our second part, and we will introduce him at the time. So please join me in welcoming Will and Andre. Thank you for being here with us today and sharing your expertise with our tech founders. I'll hand it over to both of you.
Pleasure.
Cool. Thanks, Sweeny. Nice to be here, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. This is really just intended to be a brief overview around getting the company set up. As you can see, we're going to talk about incorporation. We're going to talk a little bit about managing the cap table and some of the best practices that you should make sure you're keeping in mind. We'll talk about the ownership of IP, which is often a stumbling block when you have these kinds of, hackathon style groups get brought together. And then we'll talk a little bit about considerations during COVID-19 as well. As Sweeny mentioned, obviously, we're happy to chat about this outside as well. If you want to talk during office hours, or frankly, you can set up a meeting via Sweeny, and we're happy to chat about anything in this presentation or more. Obviously, it's just going to be a small snippet of the various things you're going to be considering right now. Sweeny, can we go to the next slide? So, incorporation, really the question here is, what are you gaining by incorporating? And one of the key sort of things that's happening when you have participants who are working together to create a product in an environment like this, One of the things that is really important is to make sure you get the IP into the company to avoid disputes later. And in these sort of hackathon style, setups, we see a lot of disputes that arise as a result of 4 or 5 of you were in this together, and then you decided to pursue the business, and then things didn't really get organized. Things didn't really get settled in terms of equity allocation, and then you find yourselves in a bit of an awkward spot a few months down the road. And our perspective here is that it's probably better to get incorporated sooner than later, so you can allocate equity among the founders so that you can actually get the IP into the company, and you can get the company organized. Because really, like, the disorganization that results from not getting organized at this point, that ultimately just ends up leading to delay and expenses and uncertainty down the road. It's a pretty minimal cost and minimal time effort to get incorporated. And so we would tend to say, for most companies, it'll make sense to get organized sooner than later and to get incorporated sooner than later. So can we go to the next slide? I'm expecting that most of you probably already are part of corporations, probably know a fair amount about what it means to be in a corporation. But in case you don't, or in case you need a refresher, the corporation's really, it's a separate legal entity. It's intended to be separate from you guys, and as the founders, the corporation's going to own the assets. It's going to own the IP. It's going to have to pay taxes. It's going to enter into contracts. It's going to hire employees. It's going to do sort of the various legal relationships, or create those legal relationships, as opposed to having the legal relationships rest directly with you as the founders. And there's some advantages there in terms of it also separates liability from you as the individual founders. But as a result of creating this legal entity, there's also some governance that you need to be aware of. Like you should be aware of who owns the company, who actually manages the company, who operates it on the day-to-day. And in the early days, those hats are kind of all being worn by the same people. But as you grow, as you get financing, as the business becomes more sophisticated, the different hats become more relevant. And so it's important to get at least a high level grasp of what the roles are in the incorporation. So the corporation's really owned. It's owned by the shareholders. It's managed by the directors. The directors oftentimes will see companies come in and hand out board seats to sort of everyone involved. It may or may not be appropriate to hand out board seats to everyone involved. There's the potential for some personal liability to attach to directors. But also just, the board is actually managing a lot of the most important decisions that are happening with the company. So if you have someone who owns 1% of the company, they may be part of the founding team. It may not be appropriate for them to actually be part of the board of directors. Similarly, the officers, the board and the officers also have legal duties that, they have fiduciary duties to the corporation to act in the best interest of the corporation. And on many of you will probably have, multiple companies on the go, multiple ideas that you're looking to pursue. But you should be aware that, if you are on the board of a company, you do have duties to that company, and those may impact your ability to sort of pursue things outside of the company. I think one of the things that actually gets overlooked most, though, is when you're getting the company set up. There's a difference between setting up a high growth business and a lifestyle business. High growth business is really designed to grow through financing primarily. It should have a slightly different capital structure at the outset. There are some different tax considerations in that regard. And the documents you use to get incorporated should contemplate that this is a high growth business. One of the sort of most painful things we see happen is companies come to us with a capital structure or a business structure that they may have spent hours and hours negotiating, thousands of dollars, designing and getting set up, and it may not actually be appropriate for the kind of business they're trying to build.
The other consideration will also be, having a good accountant in your corner when you're looking at, especially if you're looking to set up that quote unquote lifestyle business, that owner operator business that grows organically. It's never too early to think about the tax plan when you're setting up a lifestyle business versus a high growth business where you're really setting this up. The structure is really predicated on bringing in multiple stakeholders, so advisors, directors, investors, employees, and so you're really setting it up in a fundamentally different way than that lifestyle business. But say either way, having a good accountant in your corner when you're thinking through some of these issues will be extremely helpful.
Yeah, and Andre and I really spend all our time working with the high growth businesses. And so that's kind of the mindset that we take. And that's really the mindset that this presentation is created. We've created this for what we expect to be, high growth businesses, but a lot of the points will still be applicable, or at least, a number of the points will still be applicable. But there will be some deviations if you're looking to set up something that's more of a lifestyle business.
Yeah. Perhaps we can go to the next slide.
Yeah, so in terms of managing the cap table, it's likely that each of the participants on your team are going to be, effectively the founders of this business. And founders would really typically get equity. We would typically see them all get, the same class of equity. And really there are some considerations around how much time and energy each person's going to be putting into this business, whether somebody's going to be, quitting their job and pursuing it with sort of all their blood, sweat, and tears, while others may be, working in other jobs. And so there are some considerations around how you allocate equity between the founders, but as the general rule is that the founders should be getting equity, and the founders are really the people who are going to be pursuing, the commercialization of the business and pursuing the growth of the business. Now, because the founders are getting equity, or frankly anyone who's getting equity at this point, we would strongly recommend that if you're not paying for the equity, if you're not putting real money into the business, then you should have a reverse vesting agreement in place. And what a reverse vesting agreement is it's basically a right of the company to repurchase someone's shares if they don't stick around and continue to contribute to the company. So usually we call it vesting because we set up what's typically a 4-year term. And after the first year, about 25% of the equity vests and is no longer repurchasable by the company. And then every sort of quarter or a month after that first year, another sort of equal proportion vests until you get to the 4 years and the entire amount is vested. And this is really, this is a best practice for high growth businesses. And frankly, there are too many times where we see founders a year or two into the business. They started with 4 or 5 people. 3 of those people have either left or are not contributing. And they're saying, I wish they didn't have so much equity in this business because I don't feel properly incentivized to really be, spending all of my time, energy. I'm not otherwise working. I'm not otherwise drawing a salary, and here I am trying to grow this business, and it's creating value for other people who aren't actually contributing to the growth of that enterprise value. So I would say, this is really a best practice for high growth companies.
And I would just add that, this cap table that you end up setting up for high growth companies really represents that overall ownership snapshot of and everybody's economic rights. Because what you often use this document for is to have conversations with investors as to, who owns what. And it's not a legal recording. It's not the same as a shareholders register, for example, or register of, debt or anything like that. But what it does is it provides a really helpful ownership snapshot. And you don't have to show investors, your, every single detail right away. But you can, for example, If you don't want to necessarily show them how the founder's equity is split up, you can just put founder's equity as a consolidated line and show them what that represents in relation to the current investors. So it's really important to have a clean and good cap table, as good corporate and financial hygiene as you can when you're building up your company. At Fasken, we use market leading tools for cap table modeling and design and managing equity incentive programs for clients, anywhere from 2-3 shareholders all the way to hundreds of shareholders. So we use software to scale and make that efficient. Perhaps we can pop to the next slide there.
So one of the really important early considerations that I mentioned already was just around ownership of IP. So we have an IP team at Fasken that works with high growth companies every day and can really assist you with figuring out what your IP strategy needs to be. Not everyone is going to pursue patents. Not everyone is going to pursue a patent strategy. Depending on what kind of business you're building, what kind of technology you're using, it may make more or less sense to actually pursue sort of a patent strategy. But there's still other IP that you should be considering in the strategy. So, the first one we listed here, it's called a CHIOP, which is kind of a shortened form. It's confidentiality and ownership of proprietary property agreement. And what the CHIOP does is it's making sure that everyone who works for the company, every one of the founders, is actually assigning their IP into the company, or is at least agreeing to take the appropriate steps needed to assign IP more formally when that becomes necessary. And this is one of those ones where you should expect, when you do your financing round, you should expect to get reps and warranties in your purchase agreement, or frankly, when you sell the business. Reps and warranties that everyone who's worked on the business has assigned their IP into the business. And this is a critical one. And it's important to do this right. In Canada, copyright needs to be assigned in writing into the business. And as you bring on employees, as you bring on contractors, you should really have everyone ideally entering into a company sort of friendly IP assignment to make sure the company is capturing that IP and capturing that value. One of the things that we see companies come to us on a not infrequent basis with is they go onto Google and they get Google attorney at law to produce an IP assignment for them. There's a pretty critical difference between Canadian and US law that you should note on the IP assignment, and that's point 4. It's called moral rights. Moral rights are really effectively your ability to change someone else's IP. This is a concept that finds itself in Canadian IP law, Canadian copyright law, through the legislation, and as a result, it's not the same in the US. So just be aware that your IP assignment, better to have someone who actually understands the Canadian market help you with that IP assignment, and to have that IP properly transferred in. Copyright generally could be assigned, but moral rights actually need to be waived, and there's really brief but sort of kind of magic language that should be included on the moral rights side of things. Why don't we go to the next slide? So we've, COVID's been really interesting. We're obviously all working from home. Our clients are all working from home. And we're seeing all kinds of disruptions to the way these businesses have historically run or grown. I'd say one of the first things to expect right now is there are generally fewer pilots available. There are the commercial contracting side of running a startup is a little bit more challenging right now. And what we're seeing from some of the bigger clients is that cash is king right now. People really want to hold on to cash if they have cash available, and they're also frankly looking to hold on to their business and survive this. And so they're not necessarily looking to make expenses around technology in the way that they were historically, or at least not technology that they're sort of trying out for the first time or that might be new or novel. And so in that sense, it's a bit of a tougher market to find those pilots, and those pilots are critical for finding that early product market fit. So, what we would recommend is you should find partners, find accelerators, folks like at the DMZ, people who can help you get connected into clients, make warm introductions, start to get sort of more integrated into those, what will be your customers, your clients who, who can actually try out your product, can provide you with feedback. This is one of the things that we try to do is we try to make sure that we can give intros when, after we've worked with a company for a while and we have a sense of how the team operates and how the product is progressing, we try to make those intros to some of our clients sometimes, or to people we know in the space. It's not something we trade off of. We don't get paid for doing that. It's just that we found it's a helpful way to get in. And similarly, it's not just customers that we try to help with. We'll try to make introductions to investors or CTOs or CFOs or advisors, but people who can grow your business in different ways. And you should really try to surround yourself with the DMZs of the world and people who can help you build those relationships.
I think in terms of just one more point to add about the partnerships, if you have a product that can be resold, or a service that can be resold or integrated into a larger offering of a more established company that has revenue that's hurting right now because of COVID, now's a really good time to think about how to help basically increase your revenue by exploiting the distribution that bigger companies may have into a larger customer base. Just thought I'd bring that up. We have a ton of information on, the different government support system that's being built right now on, things like CERB and SEBA and some of the EDC and BDC programs. And, perhaps we could just circulate our COVID knowledge center without going into too much detail here.
Yeah, I think that's right. Like the government programs there are quite a few of them that have come out. The relevance to you guys when you're building, a brand new business, a lot of them like CERB, for example, just not that relevant. If you don't have an operating history, it's hard to have been negatively affected by COVID. So a lot of those programs are really designed to help companies who've been negatively affected. I mean, we've been seeing the financing market just generally has slowed down. There are a number of venture firms who are just playing wait and see effectively right now, who are trying to figure out, is this a recession or is this a depression? And, increasingly it looks more like a depression, which then means, well, how long is this going to go on for? And so we've seen the venture firms take a bit of a wait and see approach. Some of them, are continuing to put out new term sheets. Some of them are looking to support their existing portfolio. But financing will inherently tie into your view of how you grow this business. It may not be the same case right now that you would, start the business and then look to get it financed 3 months, 6 months in. You may still find high net worth individuals. You may find venture firms who are willing to write those early stage checks, but the financing market right now has been tough. And so you need to think about how you're going to grow the business. Do you want to sort of grow this high growth business that will sort of follow that traditional model of growing by investment, or do you want to try and build something that's more revenue focused and with the goal to be to create revenue in the early days? Certainly right now, it looks good if you have revenue, but this is a longer term sort of conversation you should have with your founders around what your plan is in terms of exiting this business, how long, you want to be in the business, how big is the market that you're looking to address here, who are the competitors, and how are you going to compete with those competitors without, raising a substantial amount of money, if at all. How much money do you need for R&D purposes? Like, there are a whole host of considerations and discussions to have with the founders. Again, not that we have time to get into it here, but certainly we're happy to have those kinds of conversations separately. And again, you can contact us through Sweeny, and we're happy to sit down on a Zoom call or get together virtually and chat about all of those kinds of things with your founding team.
Awesome. So thanks, Will and Andre, for covering the basics about company formation and considerations that entrepreneurs should have when they're trying to set up a business in this operating environment, especially. We'll take a couple of minutes to answer any questions. There aren't any right now that I can see on my screen. If anyone has any questions about any of this information that is shared, or you have anything else that wasn't, please feel free to use the Q&A dialog box. But maybe what I can do is just take the next couple of minutes and ask you both some questions that came to my mind. So we know that our participants for Hack the Curve right now are building their MVP. And they might be really focused on doing that right now, and maybe after the challenge is done, they're going to consider a lot of the information that you shared. So what would be the first thing or like one or maybe two or three key takeaways that maybe each founder here attending today should not forget and think about once, this whole COVID challenge has passed, and the something that is important, and I know you mentioned that, Will, that, you don't want to do that later rather than earlier. Any like maybe 3 points that you can highlight quickly as key takeaways?
Yeah, so one would be keep track of who's creating what IP right now. Hopefully everyone who's on your team is going to join the corporation, and we'll receive an equity consideration for joining the company. But keep track of who's creating the IP. If somebody doesn't join the company and they've actually coded your whole product for you, and they decide they don't want to continue with the company, you're going to have some decisions to be made around their contributions. How do you move away from that IP? Will they still assign that IP into the company, and that sort of thing? And then maybe I'll turn it over to Andre. And actually, just so everyone on the call knows, Stuart, who's on this call, he's an executive in residence at Fasken. He's also the CEO of a startup called Puzzle Medical. So I'd love to hear Stuart's thought on this as well. But maybe Andre, why don't you give us your thought?
No, I mean, I think the IP, understanding IP ownership and the co-ownership of IP, once you start to dive into it, you realize how beneficial it is to actually have a corporation, so that you can start trapping the value in the corporation itself. The IP is going to be more valuable if it's packaged cleanly, as opposed to, having some joint ownership agreement as between various individual contributors. So, it's more just to kind of bolster what Will was saying about value creation, really.
Yeah. I'm not sure. Stuart, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Sorry,
Yeah.
I was locked out. I mean, I would mirror everything that Will and Andre kind of just mentioned, but just highlight again, and not to reiterate, but the IP portion is extremely important. I've seen it a little too many times where co-founders get into a project and you can't delineate very clearly IP ownership or IP contribution. And then as these corporations kind of mature themselves and the technology matures, and at a certain point in time, and Will kind of alluded to this with, and Andre alluded to this with respect to keeping your cap table as clean as possible. But at a certain point in time, you can never kind of forecast and foreshadow co-founders kind of staying tied to the respective corporations at a certain point in time, and then you're forced into kind of a situation where you got to backtrack. If you don't have that documented as best as possible, it could be more of a headache than you anticipated for. So again, mirror what the gents kind of mentioned, but that I would highlight again.
Great. Thank you, Will, Andre, and Stuart, for your answer. I think we'll move on now to the next part. So what we're going to do is, if there's any questions that you think of later, and there are some others as well that I had, maybe we will carry that on in our Ask Me Anything session after Stuart speaks to us. So please feel free to continue using the Q&A dialog box. And what we'll do now is I'll introduce Stuart and just speak a little bit about this second part of our session that we're going to do right now. So Stuart Kozlick is a strategic advisor and executive in residence at Fasken. And he is an accomplished and recognized medical device and technology leader with over 17 years of experience in research, product and business development, and growth strategies. So Stuart was invited specially to host this Ask Me Anything session with all of our participants this afternoon. And thank you, Stuart, for being with us today. Before we open the floor for the AMA, perhaps you can highlight some important points a healthcare or MedTech entrepreneur should know who is developing an MVP right now in the midst of this quarantine in Canada.
Perfect. So appreciate the opportunity, and hello to everybody. Sweeny, do you have, we can go through the slides and I'll just give you just some direction. But appreciate the opportunity, and I'll try and highlight specific aspects. So I deviated a little bit from how I would normally interact with certain entrepreneurs, in the sense of typically I'll kind of instruct and counsel how to develop a company around a central medical device type of technology during a normal climate. But I've kind of focalized these types of counsels and advices and points of interest with respect to the COVID-19 era that we're living through right now. Next slide. So just as a background, and again, these definitions, I think it's important with respect to any types of innovations moving forward that everybody kind of understands the agreed upon definitions from the World Health Organization, as well as for those companies. I mean, we're proud Canadians, but those companies that go along and if you have future submissions to Health Canada, these are the agreed upon kind of definitions with respect to why are we here, what is COVID-19, a little bit of the background per se. And I think it's extremely important just to be everybody be on the same page with respect to this. Again, Sweeny will supply these slides to all the attendees thereafter. Another focus area is with respect to if you're going to have any types of innovations, okay? Typically, Health Canada, other regulatory agencies, they are here for any and all types of technologies. But right now, the main focus for the US FDA, other regulatory agencies, our regulatory agency being Health Canada right now, is the prioritization of innovations and submissions around these technologies. Okay, so masks, specific respirators, face shields, gowns, and gloves, as well as ventilators themselves. So this is what, if anybody's going to go off from this and start innovating and developing type of technology and MVP, and then kind of create a corporation around that, if it's related to any one of these bullet points, you'll be, for lack of better words, pushed to the front of the line. Otherwise, your submission will be looked at post the pandemic. Next slide. In case anybody has ever submitted a submission to Health Canada, there are usually certain regulations and rules to be able to follow. In the wake of COVID-19, all regulatory agencies around the planet basically got together and reviewed essentially the bare minimum requirements that are going to be required for any medical device application. They streamlined the process. Here in Canada, Health Canada has deemed this what's called an interim order, okay? So your MDL, your medical device establishment license, and then your Health Canada approval, will be screened with respect to this interim order, which are different regulations. So in there, in the slide, that's a snapshot of the website that you'll be able to see. There's the link. And I would urge everybody to kind of review that, but be aware that your submission process will be streamlined. Next slide. Just a couple of key points that I wanted to summarize for everybody, because it is, you know, web pages of one, web pages in length. At the end of the day, and this is outside of this climate, inside of this climate, everybody that's going to be selling or importing any type of technology, so post your development and post your testing, you're going to want to sell the device. Everybody requires still Health Canada approval. A lot of misconception around, well, we don't need Health Canada approval even for the low risk class 1 type products. No, that's not true. Everybody still needs to go through the process, even if it is going to be streamed. And then the second point that I'll bring to everybody's attention is these, providing you get the appropriated Health Canada approvals during this interim order effect, they will stay valid as long as the interim order is in effect. So if Health Canada decides that November 1st, the interim order is no longer in effect, well, then it expires 1 year after that period. So we all have to monitor kind of when the regulatory agencies say, all right, we're out of this pandemic, we're going to revert back to things as normal. Next slide. It's also important to know that in order to help get these innovations through to the regulatory agencies, especially those that do fall under COVID-19, any COVID-19 type of innovation, all the fees have been waived. So there is no external and direct cost to medical device manufacturers looking to be able to push their innovations through. In a normal type of climate, there are associated fees that will be strapped back on once we're outside of this interim order phase. Next slide. There are still things that Health Canada, the US FDA are going to require companies, medical device companies, to still adhere to, okay? But they are going to be breaking down and not being as strict on some of these elements. Traditionally, for any medical device manufacturer, you're going to require a quality management system, which is essentially a protocol and process type system to regulate the repeatability and reliability of everything that you do within your four walls of your company. Health Canada is still going to require certain levels of that, but they won't require what's called MDSAP certification. And that is a type of certification that makes you holistic amongst the 6 different countries that are part of that program. So they've stripped that away and made your quality system requirements a little bit easier to gain traction on. Next slide. This is essentially just a summary. Any Health Canada submission or US FDA submission is going to require evidence and information around these bullet points, okay? Again, during the interim order for COVID-19 type of technologies, these are the bare minimum type areas that everybody needs to understand. And again, we don't have enough time to go through every single one of these definitions. I will highlight the 3 bolded ones just at a very high level and extract out the specific elements, just so that everybody's kind of aware of, even though they've streamlined the process, there's still going to be scrutinous in certain areas. Next slide. So intended use, again, I won't take the time to read through these specific definitions, but what's extremely important is that essential, that first bullet, okay? You need to be able to describe in a unilateral type of manner the intended purpose and mechanism and indication for use and conditions in which your device is going to be utilized in. Okay, so if you're working on face shields as an example, you need to be able to describe in a uniform fashion independent of specific geographies, so then that intended use can be slapped towards the United States or any other geography that you're going to want to sell and export to. Intended use is a key mechanism during the submission process. Next slide. There's a lot of bullet points on here, and the idea here is just so that everybody can walk away. Again, Sweeny will provide the slides, but these are the bare minimum requirements to show and prove safety and efficacy of your technology that you're working on. It doesn't matter whether you're a class 1 like a mask. It doesn't matter whether you're a class 2 or a ventilator. You need to ensure and be aware that you're going to need to create test data or data to prove the quality, safety, and efficacy of your technology. Usually this slide would be 4 or 5 slides long. So this is where the streamlined portion of Health Canada has come into play, and it's really only these bullet point areas. Next slide. Same thing as intention for use. You need to provide instructions for use, so directions for use. Even if it's a mask, even if it's as self-explanatory as individuals put on the face shield over their head, et cetera, we want to ensure appropriated safety utilization of these types of technologies. So providing proper directions for use are extremely important. Next slide. I just wanted to give essentially an example. If anybody here kind of goes off and they decide they want to be a ventilator type company, which there's a lot of ventilator type business going on around the world, I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of a comparison of what would normally be required and happen outside of a COVID-19 type pandemic versus where we find ourselves today. So again, during the Q&A or outside of this call, we can go through these specific type details of the difference. Next slide. And then I wanted to be able to arm everybody with as much information as possible. There is a plethora of information and guidance, and a lot of the governments themselves, the regulatory agencies, they're finding themselves in a little bit of new territory. So a lot of work has gone into kind of creating these reference documents, both with respect to Health Canada. There are ISO standards, so second column, third bullet. The ISO organization has opened up some of the standards that usually cost about $500–600 each to allow companies to both construct themselves from the bottom up around risk management, corporate risk mitigation, corporate structure, quality management system, et cetera, but then also opened up those specifications that some of these technologies need to meet and adhere to. And those are free. So if anybody's going to go off and create a startup or innovate around any of the aforementioned type of technologies for COVID-19, I would urge you to go look at the standards and ensure that you follow those accordingly. And so that kind of summarizes that, and we can go through a lot more details required during Q&A or during offline or a second part of a webinar.
Great. Thank you very much, Stuart. That was very helpful. So thank you for sharing that with us. What I'll do now is invite Will and Andre to rejoin us as we continue with the Ask Me Anything session. And again, there are some questions that I think I have as well that might benefit our participants that are hearing, the presentation who have joined us today. If there are any questions, again, please feel free to write them in the Q&A dialog box. And what I will ask Stuart, I think the first question is, as we're developing this MVP right now, mainly for the Canadian market, is there a benefit, or should a founder keep in mind the US market, as that's obviously the larger player in the economy, in mind as they developing their product? And if yes, the answer is yes, then anything additional that they should keep in mind or consider?
So a couple of things to answer that. One, I think it's always extremely important to understand your market availability with respect to any technology, even if you're focusing on COVID-19 and you're going to be working with our regulatory agencies. Something to be aware of is Health Canada is monitoring, for example, the shortages or the availability of some of these technologies at all our institutions across the nation, as well as they're working directly with the US FDA to be able to do the exact same thing in the United States. The key thing here is again, working with the regulatory agencies upstream, upfront, and understanding what your market penetration will be during COVID-19. And then again, if you've invested your time, you've created this company, you are going to have an MVP, you're going to have exciting technology, you're going to have IP. It's going to be extremely important to also parallel some of your efforts and understand, well, what's going to happen post the pandemic? Can you have a sustainable business accordingly? And therefore, what is my go-to-market strategy and my market penetration accordingly? I mean, this is just general homework that any startup should be able to do to be able to charge appropriated sustainability around their corporation.
Thanks, Stuart. I think the other question maybe to Will and Andre is, you spoke a little bit about employee stock options. So Just one question around that. If people are very unfamiliar with this and this is their, first time being a founder, does it make sense for a founder to give employee stock options to non-management level team members that might be part of the founding team?
Yeah, I mean, we often see granting stock options as a compensation tool for non-founding or founding team, or sort of early contributors that are key to the company that may not be a CFO or CEO or CTO, if you will. But we do see stock options as a tool for compensation. I think the important thing with granting stock options is managing the rights around those stock options, and any well-drafted, pretty standardized stock option plan will contain some of the standard restrictions that you would want to see when you have key contributors come on and sign. So, there are mechanisms already in place for dealing with a scenario where that key contributor, leaves the company, or you want to terminate the key contributor, or, those kinds of things. Their vesting schedule, the rate at which, they quote unquote earn their options, if you will, which is that vesting schedule. So to sum it up, we definitely see that stock options are used often as a tool to incentivize, key contributors.
One thing to note as well, to go back to Andre's sort of earlier point about why it's so important to have a good accountant in the early days. There are tax implications that go along with stock options, and if the exercise price isn't at fair market value, or if it's below fair market value, to be more specific, there can be certain tax implications that result to the holder of the options down the road, after the options have been exercised and sold and that sort of thing. Also, just keeping an eye on whether you're a Canadian controlled private corporation. There are a whole host of tax implications that flow out of being a CCPC or not being a CCPC.
Yeah.
And then, thirdly on that tax front would be if there are option, if you're going to make an option grant to someone who's not resident in Canada, there will be sort of local, for example, in the US, there are very specific rules that the IRS has around treatment of those options, especially if the exercise price is below fair market value, and steps that you should be taking to determine fair market value and that sort of thing. And so having a good accountant is really helpful to have some of those conversations around the tax implications of option grants.
Great, thank you, Will and Andre. I think my next question is more directed towards Stuart. You mentioned about the interim order that Health Canada has put in effect right now. And if a founder submits their application under that interim order and it's approved, and once that interim order has elapsed, you were mentioning that now that's no longer in effect. So how does it affect me as a founder who had this approved, and now that the interim order has lapsed? Like, what are my next steps? What should I do? How does it impact a founder?
The only way that I can answer that question is we're still in uncharted territories, which is why Health Canada and the US FDA kind of put that 1-year grace period. My guess, however, will be that once the interim order starts to fade away, and any submissions that were basically placed will fall into that grace period, and then the regulatory agencies will be reaching out with the appropriated next steps. I would be surprised if they would need to, if any company would need to resubmit to the associated regulatory agency versus amend their submission with any of the criteria that was kind of stripped away, streamlined through the process. The important thing is, and I'm advising companies presently that are literally in this situation, is, focus on your submission through the interim order. But if you have the capability and capacity, start parallelizing efforts to be able to start accumulating the true data that you would need for an eventual true submission or an amended submission. That's kind of what I project. I unfortunately don't have a concrete black and white answer of what the regulatory agencies will do when we reach that stage yet.
Great. Okay, that's great. Thank you for just, I guess, giving us the candid answer to that question, which is a lot of the time the case now with COVID. Everything is up in the air until it's not. So I guess my final question, and this might be a very simple one, but is there a difference or a benefit or a consideration in terms of how long it takes, the process, the cost to be incorporated at the federal level versus at the provincial level, especially at this time? Is there a difference? What should be considered? Any direction on that to founders?
I mean, it's all relatively similar. Actually, with COVID's bringing up an interesting consideration, which is with a federal incorporation, you can actually do a lot more online. And with, let's say, a provincial one, and by provincial, I'm just right now speaking about the province of Ontario. With a provincial one, you can incorporate electronically, but actually to amend your articles, and amending articles can be things like changing your corporate name, changing your share classes. So if you want to do a financing and you want to bring in a new class of shares for new investors, you actually have to submit in person 2 wet ink signature copies of the articles of amendment. So it's a real pain to as you can imagine right now, it'd be a pretty big pain to coordinate that signing process and delivery process. When it comes to, I'll just touch really quickly on naming issues. And so when you try to reserve a corporate name for an Ontario company, you can essentially get any name you want as long as it's not spelt identically to another existing name. So like you can have, Nike Inc. with like 3 or 4 E's on Nike, and you can incorporate it, but federally that just wouldn't fly. And so, federally you kind of have, a little bit of a higher bar for name reservation. So going through that process federally, I think, is actually a nicer process to go through earlier especially if you've already considered, some naming and branding of your business.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that. And I just want to once again thank you, Will, Andre, and Stuart, for joining us to speak to our participants of DMZ's Hack the Curve Challenge. I'm sure our attendees have found the information shared today useful and timely as they seek to create unique tech solutions to this unprecedented economic and business environment that we are all facing one way or another. If any of the attendees have any questions later on, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is on the screen, SWEENY, Sweeny@ryerson.ca. Also, please let other founders know who are unable to attend that the recording of this webinar as well as the slides will be made available. If you are a DMZ founder right now, current or alumni, you do have access to the Fasken team and our other professionals in residence at any time. So please head on to the DMZ portal and book your one-on-one virtual meeting with the Fasken team. They have regularly scheduled weekly office hours. And I just want to also let you know is that we are going to push out a poll right now to all the attendees. So if you take a minute before leaving our webinar today just to let us know how we did, that would be great. And thank you all for attending. Please feel free to leave the webinar once you've completed the poll. And thank you again to our speakers.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.